The GP7 is one of EMD's most successful first-generation diesel locomotives. This information probably comes as no shock to anyone who's into American diesel locomotives, as EMD had a record, especially in the 50s, of putting out the right locomotive for the right market at the right time. This was mainly thanks to GM's massive marketing department, which was very capable of seemingly finding demands and/or markets where there was a product in need and developing a product to fill that need. One would assume that the GP7 was simply yet another response to one of these demands found in the market. This is, however, not the case for the GP7. EMD had in fact been pushed against the ropes by the likes of Alco and Baldwin, who were producing a newfangled type of locomotive called a road switcher, a type locomotive that could handle both passenger service, freight service, and switching, as well as locals, all in one very convenient package. On the Alco side of this equation, there was the Alco RS1, as well as Alco RS2, and on the Baldwin side of the equation, there's a series of DRS and RS type locomotives. EMD's initial response to this market is quite interesting, if not completely stunning. It essentially denied that the road switcher market even existed. The company would initially attempt to compete in this market with a slightly modified version of its switchers, which had an extended frame as well as room for a steam generator, before finally coming out in a somewhat more bumbled response in September of 1947 called the BL2. Based upon EMD's popular F3 series of locomotives, it lacked all-around visibility, specifically for long hood forward operations, as again the F series of locomotives by EMD were meant to be operated short hood forward and not rearward forward. To accommodate this, the company had to cut into the side of the frame and reinforce it. This gave the crew the equivalent of a letterbox to look through to handle long hood forward operations, not practical considering the switch jobs required great visibility for crew safety, in addition due to the complete monocoque style frame, which made the outer streamlined frame structural and dependent upon an additional internal frame for strength. There was no room to put catwalks on either side of the locomotive to connect the two ends, so while there were front porches, these were not linked. The only way to access them practically was to have the conductor climb off the locomotive and run across to the other end. There was a path through the engine room. This was itself a safety hazard, as the crew would have to move quickly through the engine room as the equipment was running and while the locomotive was in motion, raising the risk of accidentally touching a moving component and or becoming injured or burned by touching something that was hot, as the locomotive shifted around and bounced around rough track. In addition to these factors, there was the fact that this locomotive was simply too large to be used practically in tight clearance areas where some switch jobs took place, which again was part of the job description of a road switcher. Bottom line, it's not clear as to what market EMD built the BL2 for specifically, as it certainly wasn't for those customers looking for road switcher locomotives, as it had all the disadvantages of switchers and road locomotives, but lacked the advantages of both as well. Its sales reflected this. The BL2 only sold 59 units from September of 1947 to May of 1949. Alco and Baldwin managed to rake in several times this much at the same period, with products that were much more suited to this particular market. EMD finally realized it couldn't do a half-assed response if it wanted to compete successfully with Baldwin as well as Alco. It had to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch. The end result, needless to say, to this clean sheet of paper approach to designing a road switcher was the GP7. An interesting note on the naming convention for this locomotive. EMD had a huge problem with people referring to this as a, quote, Jeep, even though that is essentially, if you think about it, what this locomotive was, being capable of going anywhere and doing anything from switch jobs to locals to passenger runs, as well as freights. The main issue that the General apparently had with the name Jeep, as in terms of describing this locomotive for short, and or what made this into a four-letter word that one would not dare speak in the boardroom of General Motors, came down to corporate tinniness on General Motors' part. You see, Jeep sounded an awful lot like a model produced by Willys Overland at the time called the Jeep, a vehicle that could pretty much go anywhere and do anything, and the General felt that this drew too much attention to a competitor's product, and therefore it insisted that people refer to this locomotive as a general-purpose locomotive, apparently even referring to the locomotive as a GP-type locomotive for short was frowned upon. To deal with the issue that the F unit's bodies which were structural, were causing in terms of visibility, EMD would simply go to a body that was simply not structural, and instead would be mounted on top of a frame, kind of taking a step backwards, but it would make perfect sense. This would allow EMD to easily design in the features it would need to compete successfully in the road switcher market, such as catwalks to connect the front and rear porch areas the crew would stand upon to facilitate switching, as well as to utilize stairs instead of ladders to gain access to them when the crew were getting on and off the locomotive during switching operations. These would become critical as the footboards, which were mounted to the pilots and that crews utilized to perform switching tasks, would be outlawed by new FRA regulations, requiring the crews to use these steps to facilitate switching operations. The non-structural nature of the body would also allow EMD to customize the cab for best visibility forward for both the fireman and the engineer, allowing the crews to finally have great visibility long hood forward as well as short hood forward, critical for switching tasks. The notably slimmed down body would house a 2-cycle 16-cylinder 567B prime mover generating 1500 horsepower, which, much like the rest of the internal components of this locomotive, were carryovers from the BL2. Just like the competing offerings from Baldwin and Alco, and much like the BL2 before it, the GP7 could be equipped with steam generators and be re-geared for passenger use for railroads that wanted to use this locomotive to power commuter trains and/or short passenger runs. To accommodate longer passenger runs, the locomotive could be completely re-geared as a passenger locomotive. Maintenance on the GP7 was about as easy as it could get. In sharp contrast to the BL2, whose inherited F3 body was stripped down and modified to give the crew as much visibility as possible, which in turn further restricted access to the prime mover, requiring the shell to actually be lifted off the locomotive for anything more than minor maintenance. The GP7's extremely narrow body allowed excellent access to all of the equipment, including the prime mover, via doors that spread across the whole length of the locomotive that opened together and rolled back. This deliberate choice by EMD made it very easy to pull the prime mover completely out of the locomotive and swap it out. The GP7 proved a massive sales success for GM, selling 2,729 units, in a production run that spanned from October of 1949 all the way till May of 1954. To put this in perspective, Alco only managed to sell 1,418 of its competing model, the RS3, in the same period of time. EMD would have sold many more GP7 locomotives had it not been for the introduction of its successor, the GP9, with an updated 567C type prime mover cranking at 1,750 horsepower. EMD's GP9 would in turn go on to sell almost double the units the GP7 had sold. EMD had made the GP7 very easy to mass produce from the start. However, this actually would produce its own problems. One of these issues was the electrical cabinet itself, which was welded in place in such a way in which all the wires were hard to gain access to. The only way to actually get all the wires out of the unit was to physically strip it completely down. This issue would become an Achilles heel for these locomotives, especially as they aged, as it would force a company to rebuild the locomotives over simple wiring issues, as there was simply no way of practically rewiring them without tearing the whole locomotive apart. Another imperfection of the GP7, which would not become an issue immediately, especially considering the low fuel prices of the time, was the utilization of a 2-cycle 16-cylinder 567 prime mover. In addition to the fact that 2-cycle combustion is less efficient than 4-cycle combustion, there was the simple fact that how these engines work, which incorporates lubrication being mixed in with the fuel to help lubricate internal parts, tends to be less effective in terms of keeping everything lubricated, and thus leading to these prime movers needing to be rebuilt on a much more consistent basis than a 4-cycle combustion model. But again, these issues would not show up immediately and would not become an issue until these units began to really age and would require rebuilds. Speaking of rebuilds, the GP7 would be involved in several rebuild programs which were much in demand. This is mainly due to the railroads around the United States at that time, during the 1970s, needing locomotives to handle light-duty switch jobs, in turn requiring lighter-weight, lower-horsepower locomotives with 4-axle trucks that were not currently being produced by current locomotive manufacturers during the 1970s, mainly due to the prolonged horsepower war going on between all of the major American locomotive manufacturers at that time, at the same time having plenty of GP7s hanging around and or GP9s, which was the succeeding model of the GP7 that contained and or could be harvested for these parts, which in turn could be utilized to build these rebuilt locomotives, thus keeping the prices of these rebuild projects down to a minimal. One of the more notable programs was known as the GP8, produced in the Illinois Central's Paducah shops. 111 GP7s and 9s were put through this rebuild program, which included several electrical enhancements, as well as a slightly updated prime mover combining all of the advantages of the more powerful 567C, but still maintaining the 1500 horsepower rating of the 567B originally installed in the GP7s. This rebuilt variant of the 567 prime mover would be known as the 567BC. These locomotives were also equipped with a sophisticated air intake system to keep dirt and particulate out of the engine room area, as new discoveries in locomotive maintenance and equipment maintenance in general found that this would reduce maintenance and/or downtime of the locomotives. In addition to internal and/or electrical modifications, these locomotives also featured chopped noses. This is to say, the high nose that these locomotives came with, which was the case for most EMD road switcher products manufactured at the time, was cut down to a lower level to allow the placement of an additional window right next to the engineer as well as the fireman for better forward visibility out of the locomotive. With the success of its GP8 rebuild program, the Illinois Central would follow this up with its GP10 rebuild program. Very similar to the GP8, except it included a 567C prime mover, updating the horsepower to 1,750, instead of the 1,500 horsepower of the hybrid, if you will, 567BC. Seeing the notable success rebuild programs like the GP8 had, General Motors decided to get in on the act, offering factory rebuilds to GP10 and 11 standards for these models. The GP7 would prove a successful counterpunch to the products being produced at the time in terms of road switchers from Baldwin and Alco. Several of these engines in original as well as rebuild form can be seen in operation to this day due to the massive numbers that were originally produced. This locomotive most definitely left its mark on the American railroad scene. And that's going to do it for this video. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up. If not, thumbs down. Please subscribe as it will help me greatly, and as always, keep the metal side down.